Chapter 10 After we had had out our laugh, Lop Ear and I curved back on our flight and got breakfast in the blueberry swamp. It was the same swamp to which I had made my first journeys in the world years before, accompanied by my mother. I had seen little of her in the intervening time. Usually when she visited the horde at the caves, I was away in the forest. I had once or twice caught glimpses of the Chatterer in the open space, and had had the pleasure of making faces at him and angering him from the mouth of my cave. Beyond such amenities I had left my family severely alone. I was not much interested in it, and anyway, I was doing very well by myself. After eating our fill of berries and 2 nestfuls of partly hatched quail eggs for dessert, Lop Ear and I wandered circumspectly into the woods toward the river. Here was where stood my old tree home, out of which I had been thrown by the Chatterer. It was still occupied. There had been increase in the family. Clinging tight to my mother was a little baby. Also, there was a girl, partly grown, who cautiously regarded us from one of the lower branches. She was evidently my sister, or half-sister, rather. My mother recognized me, but she warned me away when I started to climb into the tree. Lop Ear, who was more cautious by far than I, beat a retreat, nor could I persuade him to return. Later in the day, however, my sister came down to the ground, and there in the neighboring trees we romped and played all afternoon. And then came trouble. She was my sister, but that did not prevent her from treating me abominably, for she had inherited all the viciousness of the Chatterer. She turned upon me suddenly in a petty rage, and scratched me, tore my hair, and sank her sharp little teeth deep into my forearm. I lost my temper. I did not injure her, but it was undoubtedly the soundest spanking she had received up to that time. How she yelled and squalled! The Chatterer, who had been away all day, and who was only then returning, heard the noise and rushed for the spot. My mother also rushed, but he got there first. Lop Ear and I did not wait his coming. We were off and away, and the Chatterer gave us a chase of our lives through the trees. After the chase was over, and Lop Ear and I had had our laugh, we discovered that twilight was falling. Here was night with all its terrors upon us, and to return to the caves was out of the question. Red Eye made that impossible. We took refuge in a tree that stood apart from other trees, and high up in a fork we passed the night. It was a miserable night. For the first few hours it rained heavily. Then it turned cold, and a chill wind blew upon us. Soaked through, with shivering bodies and chattering teeth, we huddled in each other's arms. We missed the snug, dry cave that so quickly warmed with the heat of our bodies. Morning found us wretched and resolved. We would not spend another such night. Remembering the tree shelters of our elders, we set to work to make one for ourselves. We built the framework of a rough nest, and on higher forks overhead even got in several ridge poles for the roof. Then the sun came out, and under its benign influence we forgot the hardships of the night, and went off in search of breakfast. After that, to show the inconsequentiality of life in those days, we fell to playing. It must have taken us all of a month, working intermittently, to make our tree house, and then, when it was completed, we never used it again. But I run ahead of my story. When we fell to playing, after breakfast, on the second day away from the caves, Lop Ear led me a chase through the trees and down to the river. We came out upon it where a large slough entered from the blueberry swamp. The mouth of this slough was wide, while the slough itself was practically without a current. In the dead water, just inside its mouth, lay a tangled mass of tree trunks. Some of these, what of the wear and tear of freshets and of being stranded long summers on sandbars, were seasoned and dry and without branches. They floated high in the water, and bobbed up and down or rolled over when we put our weight upon them. Here and there between the trunks were water cracks, and through them we could see schools of small fish like minnows darting back and forth. Lop Ear and I became fishermen at once. Lying flat on the logs, keeping perfectly quiet, waiting till the minnows came close, we would make swift passes with our hands. Our prizes we ate on the spot, wriggling and moist. We did not notice the lack of salt. The mouth of the slough became our favorite playground. Here we spent many hours each day catching fish and playing on the logs, and here one day we learned our first lessons in navigation. The log on which Lop Ear was lying got adrift. He was curled up on his side, asleep. A light fan of air slowly drifted the log away from the shore, and when I noticed his predicament, the distance was already too great for him to leap. At first the episode seemed merely funny to me. But when one of the vagrant impulses of fear, common in that age of perpetual insecurity, moved within me, I was struck with my own loneliness. I was made suddenly aware of Lop Ear's remoteness out there on that alien element a few feet away. I called loudly to him a warning cry. He awoke frightened and shifted his weight rashly on the log. It turned over, sousing him under. 3 times again it soused him under as he tried to climb out upon it. Then he succeeded, crouching upon it and chattering with fear. I could do nothing, nor could he. Swimming was something of which we knew nothing. We were already too far removed from the lower life forms to have the instinct for swimming, and we had not yet become sufficiently manlike to undertake it as the working out of a problem. I roamed disconsolately up and down the bank, keeping as close to him in his involuntary travels as I could, while he wailed and cried, till it was a wonder that he did not bring down upon us every hunting animal within a mile. The hours passed. The sun climbed overhead and began its descent to the west. The light wind died down and left Lop Ear on his log floating around 100 feet away. And then somehow, I know not how, Lop Ear made the great discovery. He began paddling with his hands. At first his progress was slow and erratic. Then he straightened out and began laboriously to paddle nearer and nearer. I could not understand. I sat down and watched, and waited until he gained the shore. But he had learned something which was more than I had done. Later in the afternoon he deliberately launched out from shore on the log. Still later he persuaded me to join him, and I too learned the trick of paddling. For the next several days we could not tear ourselves away from the slough. So absorbed were we in our new game that we almost neglected to eat. We even roosted in a nearby tree at night, and we forgot that Red Eye existed. We were always trying new logs, and we learned that the smaller the log, the faster we could make it go. Also we learned that the smaller the log, the more liable it was to roll over and give us a ducking. Still another thing about small logs we learned. One day we paddled our individual logs alongside each other, and then quite by accident in the course of play, we discovered that when each, with one hand and foot, held on to the other's log, the logs were steadied and did not turn over. Lying side by side in this position, our outside hands and feet were left free for paddling. Our final discovery was that this arrangement enabled us to use still smaller logs and thereby gain greater speed. And there our discoveries ended. We had invented the most primitive catamaran, and we did not have sense enough to know it. It never entered our heads to lash the logs together with tough vines or stringy roots. We were content to hold the logs together with our hands and feet. It was not until we got over our first enthusiasm for navigation and had begun to return to our tree shelter to sleep at night that we found the Swift One. I saw her first, gathering young acorns from the branches of a large oak near our tree. She was very timid. At first she kept very still, but when she saw that she was discovered, she dropped to the ground and dashed wildly away. We caught occasional glimpses of her from day to day, and came to look for her when we traveled back and forth between our tree and the mouth of the slough. And then, one day, she did not run away. She waited our coming and made soft peace sounds. We could not get very near, however. When we seemed to approach too close, she darted suddenly away, and from a safe distance uttered the soft sounds again. This continued for some days. It took a long while to get acquainted with her, but finally it was accomplished, and she joined us sometimes in our play. I liked her from the first. She was of the most pleasing appearance. She was very mild. Her eyes were the mildest I had ever seen. In this she was quite unlike the rest of the girls and women of the folk who were born viragos. She never made harsh, angry cries, and it seemed to be her nature to flee away from trouble rather than to remain and fight. The mildness I have mentioned seemed to emanate from her whole being. Her bodily as well as facial appearance was the cause of this. Her eyes were larger than most of her kind, and they were not so deep set, while the lashes were longer and more regular. Nor was her nose so thick and squat. It had quite a bridge, and the nostrils opened downward. Her incisors were not large, nor was her upper lip long and down-hanging, nor her lower lip protruding. She was not very hairy, except on the outsides of arms and legs and across the shoulders, and while she was thin-hipped, her calves were not twisted and gnarly. I have often wondered, looking back upon her from the 20th century through the medium of my dreams, and it has always occurred to me that possibly she may have been related to the Fire People. Her father or mother might well have come from that higher stock. While such things were not common, still they did occur, and I have seen the proof of them with my own eyes, even to the extent of members of the horde turning renegade and going to live with the Tree People. All of which is neither here nor there. The Swift One was radically different from any of the females of the horde, and I had a liking for her from the first. Her mildness and gentleness attracted me. She was never rough, and she never fought. She always ran away, and right here may be noted the significance of the naming of her. She was a better climber than Lop Ear or I. When we played tag, we could never catch her except by accident, while she could catch us at will. She was remarkably swift in all her movements, and she had a genius for judging distances that was equaled only by her daring. Excessively timid in all other matters, she was without fear when it came to climbing or running through the trees, and Lop Ear and I were awkward and lumbering and cowardly in comparison. She was an orphan. We never saw her with any one, and there was no telling how long she had lived alone in the world. She must have learned early in her helpless childhood that safety lay only in flight. She was very wise and discreet. It became a sort of game with Lop Ear and me to try to find where she lived. It was certain that she had a tree shelter somewhere, and not very far away. But trail her as we would, we could never find it. She was willing enough to join with us at play in the daytime, but the secret of her abiding place she guarded jealously. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. It must be remembered that the description I have just given of the Swift One is not the description that would have been given by Big Tooth, my other self of my dreams, my prehistoric ancestor. It is by the medium of my dreams that I, the modern man, look through the eyes of Big Tooth and see. And so it is with much that I narrate of the events of that far-off time. There is a duality about my impressions that is too confusing to inflict upon my readers. I shall merely pause here in my narrative to indicate this duality, this perplexing mixing of personality. It is I, the modern, who look back across the centuries and weigh and analyze the emotions and motives of Big Tooth, my other self. He did not bother to weigh and analyze. He was simplicity itself. He just lived events, without ever pondering why he lived them in his particular and often erratic way. As I, my real self, grew older, I entered more and more into the substance of my dreams. One may dream, and even in the midst of the dream be aware that he is dreaming. And if the dream be bad, comfort himself with the thought that it is only a dream. This is a common experience with all of us. And so it was that I, the modern, often entered into my dreaming, and in the consequent strange dual personality was both actor and spectator. And right often have I, the modern, been perturbed and vexed by the foolishness, illogic, obtuseness, and general all-around stupendous stupidity of myself, the primitive. And one more thing before I end this digression. Have you ever dreamed that you dreamed? Dogs dream, horses dream, all animals dream. In Big Tooth's day, the half-men dreamed, and when the dreams were bad, they howled in their sleep. Now I, the modern, have lain down with Big Tooth and dreamed his dreams. This is getting almost beyond the grip of the intellect, I know. But I do know that I have done this thing. And let me tell you that the flying and crawling dreams of Big Tooth were as vivid to him as the falling through space dream is to you. For Big Tooth also had an other self, and when he slept, that other self dreamed back into the past, back to the winged reptiles and the clash and the onset of dragons, and beyond that to the scurrying, rodent-like life of the tiny mammals, and far remoter still, to the shore slime of the primeval sea. I cannot, I dare not say more. It is all too vague and complicated and awful. I can only hint of those vast and terrific vistas through which I have peered hazily at the progression of life, not upward from the ape to man, but upward from the worm. And now to return to my tale. I, Big Tooth, knew not the Swift One as a creature of finer facial and bodily symmetry, with long lashed eyes and a bridge to her nose and down-opening nostrils that made toward beauty. I knew her only as the mild-eyed young female who made soft sounds and did not fight. I liked to play with her, I knew not why, to seek food in her company, and to go bird-nesting with her. And I must confess she taught me things about tree climbing. She was very wise, very strong, and no clinging skirts impeded her movements. It was about this time that a slight defection arose on the part of Lop Ear. He got into the habit of wandering off in the direction of the tree where my mother lived. He had taken a liking to my vicious sister, and the Chatterer had come to tolerate him. Also, there were several other young people, progeny of the monogamic couples that lived in the neighborhood, and Lop Ear played with these young people. I could never get the Swift One to join with them. Whenever I visited them, she dropped behind and disappeared. I remember once making a strong effort to persuade her, but she cast backward anxious glances, then retreated, calling to me from a tree. So it was that I did not make a practice of accompanying Lop Ear when he went to visit his new friends. The Swift One and I were good comrades, but try as I would, I could never find her tree shelter. Undoubtedly, had nothing happened, we would have soon made it, for our liking was mutual. But the something did happen. One morning, the Swift One not having put in an appearance, Lop Ear and I were down at the mouth of the slough, playing on the logs. We had scarcely got out on the water when we were startled by a roar of rage. It was Red Eye. He was crouching on the edge of the timber jam and glowering his hatred at us. We were badly frightened, for here was no narrow-mouthed cave for refuge. But the 20 feet of water that intervened gave us temporary safety, and we plucked up our courage. Red Eye stood up erect and began beating his hairy chest with his fist. Our 2 logs were side by side, and we sat on them and laughed at him. At first our laughter was half-hearted, tinged with fear. But as we became convinced of his impotence, we waxed uproarious. He raged and raged at us, and ground his teeth in helpless fury. And in our fancied security we mocked and mocked him. We were ever short-sighted, we folk. Red Eye abruptly ceased his breast-beating and tooth-grinding, and ran across the timber jam to the shore. And just as abruptly our merriment gave way to consternation. It was not Red Eye's way to forgo revenge so easily. We waited in fear and trembling for whatever was to happen. It never struck us to paddle away. He came back with great leaps across the jam, one huge hand filled with round, water-washed pebbles. I am glad that he was unable to find larger missiles, say stones weighing 2 or 3 pounds, for we were no more than a score of feet away, and he surely would have killed us. As it was, we were in no small danger. Zip! A tiny pebble whirled past with the force almost of a bullet. Lop Ear and I began paddling frantically. Whiz-zip-bang! Lop Ear screamed with sudden anguish. The pebble had struck him between the shoulders. Then I got one and yelled. The only thing that saved us was the exhausting of Red Eye's ammunition. He dashed back to the gravel bed for more, while Lop Ear and I paddled away. Gradually we drew out of range, though Red Eye continued making trips for more ammunition, and the pebbles continued to whiz about us. Out in the center of the slough there was a slight current, and in our excitement we failed to notice that it was drifting us into the river. We paddled, and Red Eye kept as close as he could to us by following along the shore. Then he discovered larger rocks. Such ammunition increased his range. One fragment, fully 5 pounds in weight, crashed on the log alongside of me, and such was its impact that it drove a score of splinters like fiery needles into my leg. Had it struck me, it would have killed me. And then the river current caught us. So wildly were we paddling that Red Eye was the first to notice it, and our first warning was his yell of triumph. Where the edge of the current struck the slough, water was a series of eddies or small whirlpools. These caught our clumsy logs and whirled them end to end, back and forth and around. We quit paddling and devoted our whole energy to holding the logs together alongside each other. In the meanwhile, Red Eye continued to bombard us, the rock fragments falling about us, splashing water on us and menacing our lives. At the same time, he gloated over us wildly and vociferously. It happened that there was a sharp turn in the river at the point where the slough entered, and the whole main current of the river was deflected to the other bank. And toward that bank, which was the north bank, we drifted rapidly, at the same time going downstream. This quickly took us out of range of Red Eye, and the last we saw of him was far out on a point of land, where he was jumping up and down and chanting a paean of victory. Beyond holding the two logs together, Lop Ear and I did nothing. We were resigned to our fate, and we remained resigned until we aroused to the fact that we were drifting along the north shore not 100 feet away. We began to paddle for it. Here the main force of the current was flung back toward the south shore, and the result of our paddling was that we crossed the current where it was swiftest and narrowest. Before we were aware, we were out of it and in a quiet eddy. Our logs drifted slowly, and at last grounded gently on the bank. Lop Ear and I crept ashore. The logs drifted on out of the eddy and swept away down the stream. We looked at each other, but we did not laugh. We were in a strange land, and it did not enter our minds that we could return to our own land in the same manner that we had come. We had learned how to cross a river, though we did not know it, and this was something that no one else of the Folk had ever done. We were the first of the Folk to set foot on the north bank of the river, and for that matter, I believe the last. That they would have done so in the time to come is undoubted, but the migration of the Fire People and the consequent migration of the survivors of the Folk set back our evolution for centuries. Indeed, there is no telling how disastrous was to be the outcome of the Fire People's migration. Personally, I am prone to believe that it brought about the destruction of the Folk, that we, a branch of lower life budding toward the human, were nipped short off and perished down by the roaring surf where the river entered the sea. Of course, in such an eventuality, I remain to be accounted for, but I outrun my story, and such accounting will be made before I am done. End of chapter 11. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.